So Dick, tell me a little bit about your leadership style. Are you real hands-on? Do you like delegating? How do you operate?
That's a good question. I used to say that I like to manage by walking around the halls. But I think the more profound answer is I like to surround myself with people who are good at what they do, monitor what they do, but let them do it. Basically, in a lot of ways, just try to stay out of their way. And I found that over the years, that works the best for me. I'm hands-on to an extent, but not to nitty-gritty. I mean, I really like the idea of letting people do their jobs, helping them the best way you can, keeping them on track if they fall off, which we all do at one point or another, and and also supporting them and praising them in success, because it's the easiest way. It's in my opinion, it's a lot easier to be supportive than try to rule by fear or try to motivate by fear. And I've had a couple of people that I've worked for in my career who specialized in that. And for me, it never really worked maybe because I'm Irish, but I found that I would have less tolerance for an approach like that rather than somebody who was supportive and nurturing, even if they weren't a perfect manager or whatever. And I like the idea of surrounding myself by people who are good at what they do. I don't care whether I like them personally. I mean, you have to have some sense of camaraderie. But if they're good at what they do and they're straightforward and they treat their people well and they get the job done, I'm a happy guy. And that really is, and I've always, most of the jobs I've had in my career, I always look at it, my job is to kind of tell people where we're going, explain why, give them some outline of what the tools are, and then watch them do what they do to make the whole ship move forward. And you can get a lot done that way. And actually, you have a lot available to you beyond what you're currently doing if you trust the people who work for you and work with you. And that's the way I've liked to do it. And I think more or less during my career, it's worked pretty well. I'm not much of a yeller. You have to be tough sometimes. That's just the nature of the beast. But only if you have to be tough for the right reasons. And I think the thing that's most difficult for managers is making sure that people who work for you understand what your expectations are. And you need to give them enough guidance and resources and support so you know that it's achievable. So if not, you're just spinning wheels and just frustrating a lot of people, including yourself.
How did you help Samuel Goldwyn Television grow during your tenure there?
Well, I think first it was really just a case of getting it organized. I mean, in a lot of ways, when I first came in, number one, they were understaffed. I mean, I think there were 4 or 5 people there, and the expectations were that the company wanted to be doing a lot more, so they didn't have the basic resources, and they didn't know what they needed. So it was figuring out, number one, what was it that the company wanted to do, and number two, more importantly, what could they do? What type of resources were they willing to expend, and what were the ground rules of what they would do and would not do? And I found that once I understood that, it made it a lot easier for everybody, because, I mean, Sam wanted to be in television, he wanted to have a hit. Okay, well, that's good, but that's not exactly a blueprint on what you want to do, because a lot of television throughout my career, I've come to realize is how to manage failure. Because when you're doing, especially original programming, you have to assume that 8 or 9 programs out of 10 are not going to work. That is kind of the industry standard. And that's fine as long as you know it going in, and as long as you know that if you're going to fail, you have to manage the failure so you can get up to bat again. And that really came to pass when I moved over to Tribune in terms of outlining a game plan. But at Goldwyn, it was recognizing what they could and couldn't do, kind of motivating them, because there were a bunch of well-intentioned individuals who really, when I came in, there really wasn't too much leadership. Because, I mean, everybody was, like Mike Berg was trying to manage them, but he was really an international guy focused on international. So you had this group of individuals who were interested, motivated, and with little direction. So I gave them direction, gave them some resources. Sam was very gracious in giving me resources to hire more people because their staff was not competitive from a sales standpoint. They didn't have enough strong bodies out there. I mean, if you're an independent, it's difficult to begin with because you're selling against the studios that have better product, bigger sales staff, and more resources. So if you're an independent, at least you have to be able to go toe-to-toe in terms of getting enough people into the marketplace so that you can at least get the sale. And then it was really just a case of getting some quick hits right away. And the quick hits for us right away were the movies. The thing that is interesting about television in town, which I think a lot of people in the last 5 years have figured it out. In fact, there was an article not too long ago that in the LA Times that the television side of the business accounts for approximately 75 or 80% of the profits of all the studios. The motion picture side is the glamorous side, but what runs the industry is television. And in case of Goldwyn, what helped the television division was the sale of the Goldwyn titles. And not only their classic titles, but some of the new titles they were producing. And it wasn't particularly a sexy business, but it was a business that was underexploited. And when we were able to get more success selling the movies to more clients at higher prices and more aggressive terms, et cetera, that gave Sam and Myra Gottlieb, who was the COO, the confidence to reinvest some of that additional money into something like American Gladiators and some of the other pilots that we did. So it was really a case of figuring out what the problem was and setting goals that were attainable for everybody.
In 1996, you moved to Tribune Entertainment.
Yes.
What brought that about?
I was at Goldwyn. I was president of television, and the company was going down the tubes. They had released a movie called The Perez Family in March of '95 that they had invested a lot of money in, of their own money. And opening box office weekend, I think, was like $2 million. And they had, I'm not sure the exact number, but a lot of money, like 15 or 18 million into the movie. So during the summer, it became obvious to everybody that something had to be done. Goldwyn put itself up on the sales block that summer. And actually, for a while, we were hoping that Ted Turner was going to buy it, which would have been great. And he was in the process of negotiating for the Samuel Goldwyn Company when Warner's came after him and bought his company. So that kind of killed the Turner deal. So all throughout this time, I knew that there was not a long horizon on the landscape for a career at Goldwyn, just because it wasn't going to last long. It was subsequently sold to MGM and essentially shut down about a year later. So there was a job at Tribune Entertainment. Rick Jacobson, who was the CEO of Tribune Entertainment, left to take a job at Fox, and that left the CEO job open at Tribune. And I had heard about it, And actually, initially, I wasn't interested at all because it was a Chicago-based company, and I had made up my mind at that point that I did not want to leave L.A. And the guy who sold our advertising is a kind of an industry legend when I was at Goldwyn. He was the president of Group W Sales, Dan Cosgrove. And we became, initially I had to beg him to represent our product before we got Goldwyn. Our first project at Samuel Goldwyn was Body by Jake. And I literally had to get on a plane, fly into New York and say, please sell our ad time because we can't do it ourselves. And I don't know, it's a morning show. And, well, I said, we'll do bigger things. So flash forward the tape, like 5 years later, we were his largest client. And he was a great partner. And he knew what was going on at Goldwyn, and he said, you should talk to those guys at Tribune. You're one of them. I said, well, they're Chicago guys, and I'm in L.A. and I want them. He said, you should talk to them. You'll like them. So I ended up having a meeting with Dennis Fitzsimons, who at that point was president of Tribune Broadcasting. I was in New York, and I got the call, Dennis would like to meet you. Can you be there? I think like Friday, this was Wednesday, can you be there Friday for breakfast? I said, sure, no problem. When you're a syndicator and somebody says, I want you to come into the market because there's never a problem. You're on the plane regardless. Well, there was a snowstorm in New York, and I literally hung up the phone, checked out of the hotel, went to LaGuardia and stood by for 6 hours that night, finally got into Chicago like 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe 2, between 2 and 3, walking through the airport. There's not anybody. Get to the hotel about 3:30, check in, lie down, and our breakfast was at 7:30. So I was up and went down and met Dennis Fitzsimons, who I knew about through the business, but I had never met him before. I might have pitched him once, I think. But it was like he was pretty high level, so I didn't have too much access to him. And we had breakfast at the Intercontinental. It was a week before Christmas. It was still snowing, and it was like meeting a long lost brother in a lot of ways. I mean, our backgrounds were very similar. I was from Long Island. He was from Queens. We both went to Jesuit high schools. I went to Brooklyn Prep. He went to St. John's Prep for high school, and then we both went to Fordham for college. He undergraduate, and I did graduate school. So we had kind of a lot of things in common, and met with him. Like 3 days later, he called me up. He said, "Can you fly back to Chicago?" I flew back to Chicago, and he hired me. We had lunch. I met the chairman of the company, and he hired me on the spot. We agreed on the deal, and he said, okay, now, would you mind hanging around? This is 5 o'clock on Friday. We're having a meeting to decide what we want to do with all of the offices of Tribune Entertainment. So okay, yeah, and I'll hang around for that. And because he wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do with Tribune Entertainment, whether to fold it down or to let it stay as it was or to grow it. And this was kind of a strategy meeting that he was working on. So I stayed for that, and that was I really started with boots on the ground immediately. Caught like an 8 o'clock flight out of Chicago, that night with a whole list of things I had to do by Monday. And that started a 10-year run.
So what began as I guess with his guidance, maybe to some degree, maybe not, you had the job now. What was your vision? What did you see as the growth of Tribune from that point on, from your starting point?
Well, it was, I think we figured it out together, and we came at it from very different approaches. And Dennis is a very, very smart guy, and he said from day one, just so you know, there's always going to be some tension between the station side and the entertainment division. So don't feel bad, don't take it personally, but there are different agendas. You guys are in different businesses, and we'll be, I'll make sure that there's a balance that's fair. But kind of lay out the game plan that you think we should do, and I'll tell you what's right or wrong with it, according to what I want to do. So I said, okay, well, the first thing we have to do right off the bat is we got to get out of Chicago. And he said, well, this is the headquarters. I said, I know, but the business that I'm in is in Los Angeles. He said, yeah, but those guys will fly to Chicago too. I said, well, yeah, but any agent is going to see everybody in LA once or twice before they're going to get on the plane and fly to Chicago to pitch you a project or to pitch me a project. So I said, and that's where the business is. So he said, okay, no, not a problem, but just do it prudently. So, and we did. When I first started with Tribune, we had something like, I don't know, 45 people in New York, 60 people in Chicago, and 5 in LA. And 2 or 3 years later, we had 40 people in New York, 10 people in Chicago, and 60 people in LA. But we did it through, other than when I first got in there, I downsized 20%, which is probably the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my career. Because once you took a look, I mean, they had a good-sized staff, and they literally didn't have a project on the air. They had Geraldo, which had been given to King World to sell, so they were kind of Tribune was kind of managing, but really weren't involved in the sales. So we were definitely overstaffed. So downsized it by 20%, and then over time moved people, hired people in Chicago. First of all, offered a lot of people in Chicago jobs in LA. None of them wanted them, which I could understand because Chicago is a great place to live, and LA is kind of a foreign land to the people who were born and raised in LA in Chicago from a career standpoint. And then through attrition and just adding new functions in LA, we changed the balance without really any type of expense. And then it was figuring what were the assets that Tribune had that were unique to Tribune that we could exploit. And the most obvious, and this wasn't brain surgery, Tribune had some of the best independent, if not the best independent stations in the country. WPIX in New York, WGN in Chicago, which was also the superstation, KTLA in Los Angeles. I mean, these were great stations, programmed well, they had smart managers, they were operated very well. So we had a good platform. So then it was a case of, okay, what type of programming can we do that feeds that platform that doesn't have a lot of risk? Because Dennis was pretty adamant, and correctly so, that he didn't want to get into the studio type of business. Like, he didn't want to get into sitcoms. He didn't want to have anything that could have hurt the bottom line in a significant way. I mean, he was willing to risk, but it was prudent risk. So we kind of defined what we would do and what we would not do. We wouldn't do any sitcoms, talk show if we could find the right one. We had Geraldo at the time. But one of the things that was pretty obvious to me is that the stations actually had 1 or 2 hours on their schedules that were working pretty well, that were getting old, like they had Hercules, which is a pretty good size hit that Universal had. So I said, that to me is a natural avenue of expansion. We have the time periods. It's not going to cost any money for the stations to buy the programming. If we can get the right international partners, they'll pay 75% of the budget. If we get the right type of programming that works in New York, Chicago, and LA, and also works over in Germany, France, and the UK, we can have them finance our programming. And actually, that's exactly what we did. Once we figured out the businesses that we should be in and could not be in. Then I hired a guy by the name of Dick Lippin, who was a very well-known publicist here in Los Angeles, still is. And we put together a marketing plan essentially to put Tribune Entertainment in LA on the map. Because, again, it was only a 5-person office when I took over, 5-person and me. So we came up with a plan on, here's our long-term goals. We're going to grow the LA business. We want to get into original programming. We want to do international co-productions. And we're willing to commit the station's time periods and backing and support to do so. Well, then things changed fairly quickly, at least in terms of becoming a player in town. For a long time, we weren't even getting the calls before the change. I mean, we were kind of the last stop. We were the stop you had to go to Chicago. Well, now we have an LA presence. We had a development CEO. The first person I hired in Los Angeles was a business affairs person, David Burson, who's still around over at Bunim Murray. And this was an interesting conversation with Dennis, because Dennis would say, I said, I have to hire a business affairs guy. He said, what do you mean? I said, I need a lawyer. He said, well, no, we have a whole tower full of lawyers in Chicago. They're really good. And I said, no, I know they're good, but it's a different business. And in LA, certain meetings, if I walk in without my business affairs guy with me, it's like coming to a war unarmed. I mean, you're dead meat the minute you walk in. And he got that, and he said, fine. So I hired David Burson, we got a CFO. So we had the 5 major functions, and over time we expanded them. And we started getting pitches on projects. And I knew from Flipper and talking to other people the type of programming that we thought would work. I mean, it had to be action-oriented, because action is, number one, the stations loved action because they were doing well with the action movies. Number 2, action works well in place of language. So for foreign territories, if it's a good action type of hour, it will work. So we started defining on what we would do and what we wouldn't do. And I was there. We put a couple projects into development. First project we actually shot, we shot a pilot. I don't think it was a full it wasn't a full hour. It might have been a sizzle tape, but it was an expensive sizzle tape with Glenn Larson, who was a very prolific producer. He did Knight Rider, et cetera. And he had bought in a 1-page comic of Nightman that he had the rights from Marvel. He said, I want to do this with you, and we talked about it. So we put that into development, and there was another show that David Kirshner, who was a very good feature producer, he had done a sizzle reel himself to pitch me and people like me in town called, well, then it was called Battlefield Earth. It was Gene Roddenberry's Battlefield Earth. We ended up having to change the title right away because that was the same title as the feature that John Travolta did that did about 25 cents in the box office. But we ended up, long story short, going out to the market, and our stations, what we would try to do, because our stations, the thing that most people in town didn't understand initially is that they always assumed that you controlled the station. So if I wanted to do something, I had to put to the stations where they had to take it. Well, that wasn't the case, and that wasn't the model. I mean, I had to go sell our stations the programming. And if they didn't like it, and a lot of it they didn't, that was the end of it. But we put together these 2 shows. We did 3. And we bought 3 out. I said, just take 1. That's all I'm asking. Just take 1. We can go to series with 1. And they took 2. They took Battleground, Earth Final Conflict was his eventual title, and Nightman. Then I had to find the rest of the financing because the stations committed for a year, time periods in prime time, which was great, double runs, which was great. But we only had essentially a third of the budget covered. So then I went over to MIP and MIPCOM and found the rest of the financing from international partners. In the case of one project, Nightman was a co-venture with TF1 in France and Village Roadshow, the guys who did Flipper with in Australia. And the other one was a company called, then it was called Atlantis. They subsequently became Alliance Atlantis. That was the company that ended up with the international rights to CSI that ended up selling for something like $30 or $40 million 3 or 4 years later. So and that's really what got us started in the action hour business. And Nightman lasted 2 years, and it started off well. It just really we never got it right. But Earth Final Conflict was on the air for 5 years. Then we sold the back end to the Sci-Fi Network. And we followed up with Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, which starred Kevin Sorbo, partnered again with another Canadian company called Fireworks, went over to MIP and sold it all around. And that became a very good business for us, the action hour. It was limited risk. It wasn't really asking much of a commitment from the stations. And when they went 5 years, there was a significant, it was a very profitable project. All of them were. We never really lost money on any of them.
Let's talk about some of the shows,
Okay.
and some of those shows specifically. First of all, Geraldo was a show that already existed.
Yes.
And so you more or less took it over, inherited it, sort of?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah, Geraldo had been on the air. He was started by Tribune Entertainment, I say probably 5 years before I got there. And as he and I kidded about it later, several years later after I started, I kind of got him on the backside of the life cycle of that particular show. And it was a great relationship. Started out very rocky. When I first came into Tribune, I spent a while analyzing the projects and the profitability and the marketing and the sales and all that type of stuff that you have to do, and looking at some of the contracts. And I realized with Geraldo we had a problem. So I called up Dennis Fitzsimons. I said, I've been reviewing this, and we got a problem here with, not Geraldo personally, but the project. And I said, we're supposed to be partners on this, aren't we? He said, yeah, that's the deal. I said, well, it's not working that way. And as it turned out, it's supposed to be a 50-50, but somewhere over the course of the years, through no manipulation or whatever, but Geraldo was making a lot more money than Tribune was, like 60-40, 70-30. Yeah. So he said, well, you got to do something about that. So I called up Jim Griffin, who's Geraldo's agent in New York, and I had met Geraldo once or twice. Hi, how are you? I'm the new guy. Yeah, good luck, and that type of thing. And I said, I have to come in, and I'd like to meet with you and Geraldo. And Dennis is going to fly in, too, because I said to Dennis, I don't want to do this by myself. I mean, you're my dad on this one. So we walked in, and I said, this is kind of a tough meeting here. And Geraldo said, why? Everything's going great. I said, well, yeah, I guess it is. From your side of the table. I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let me show you something. So I just kind of laid out one sheet, real simple, of numbers. I said, this is supposed to be a 50-50 partnership, and, look at the numbers. He said, oh, geez, I didn't know that. Geez, that's too bad. He said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I hate to say this, but first thing we're going to have to do is cut your salary $1 million. And, God bless him, he said, you know what, that's fair. He said, we didn't realize this, we don't see these numbers, and I don't like it, but that's okay. So I said, well, thanks. I mean, you made this a lot easier than you could have, because I didn't know what to expect. And we became very friendly after that, and I would fly in, and he was doing CNBC at the time over in Fort Lee, and we'd meet over in the lanes for drinks, after the show, 11 o'clock for an hour or so. Next year, about the same time of year, I had to fly in and do the same thing. I said, Geraldo, I hate to say this, but you got to cut your salary another $1 million. And we went through the numbers. He said, okay, fine, no more meetings. This is it. And as it turns out, we tried to keep him on the air, but he got a great offer from Fox News. And from a career standpoint, it was a no-brainer. So we reluctantly parted, and I've been a big fan of his. I think he's a pro. And he was great to work with. I mean, he really got it, and he was a great partner in all senses of the word.
Did Dennis stay based in Chicago?
Yes.
He didn't move to L.A. Okay.
No.
You also were successful partnering with other big companies like Tribune with DreamWorks and Fremantle Media,
yes.
North America, Hearst, Sony.
Yeah.
Tell me about that strategy.
Well, the thing that was very important about Tribune is that, number one, the stations were, they were an asset that a lot of other companies didn't have. So part of our strategy was always to, use the stations if you can, if it makes sense to the stations. But then also partner. I mean, we had learned quite a bit of good news from partnering with the international partners. So I was looking to expand our operation because we had several shows on the air. We had a couple of strips, and we were looking to smart ways to expand what we could do. And Fremantle was a good case in point. Fremantle was an independent distributor, actually a competitor of ours. And they didn't have a station group, so slowly but surely they were dissipating. They didn't have the resources. They had pretty good projects because they had the entire Goodson Todman library, and they had 3 projects on the air. So there was a new CEO in town, new sheriff called Cecile Frocutaz, who is now chairman of Fremantle Worldwide. And he had just come to town, and she was kind of tasked with what to do with All-American / Pearson, because that's what they were then. So I made a proposal. I said, why don't you're duplicating what you need to do. Why don't you let us sell those projects and close down your division? Because it's going to happen sooner or later. If you're not going to put more, the thing about syndication, if you don't keep on feeding the pipeline, sooner or later it's going to atrophy and die. And she knew that. I mean, she was a smart lady. So we made a deal that we would take over all the distribution of what became Fremantle. It was Pearson at the time, became Fremantle. And that turned out to be a very great relationship. In fact, I'm still working with Cecile today as we speak. And very similar argument with Hearst. Bruce Paisner was president of Hearst. He's now chairman of the International Television Academy. And they had a bunch of movies that they had been syndicating, and because they had no new movies, so I made a proposal, well, let's take over all of your movie business, and we'll just, we'll do it at a fee, and you'll save all of your overhead. You won't have to manage anything. You'll still be there because somebody's got to get the checks and make sure everything runs. And we made a deal so that we took over all of their distribution. And in the case of DreamWorks, the DreamWorks deal was really probably one of the most innovative deals I think we did, because DreamWorks had been founded by the 3 famous founders, and they had kept all of their distribution rights themselves because they're a studio. So at one point, they hired a former Disney / Paramount executive by the name of Bob Jackaman to represent them, to go and find a distributor for their entire library. Now, these are films that had never been in syndication, and it was all of them. I mean, from day one to I think the deal went through 2006 to 2007. I mean, the package had something like 81 Oscar nominations, 55 Academy Awards. I mean, it was every good DreamWorks title you've ever heard of. But the challenge was that it was essentially something like 58 movies that you were bidding for 30 years. So they wanted to know that you would sell for 30 years. And you had to kind of figure out, what's that worth? And, I mean, nobody knows. So, and we were vying against all the studios, because at that point, actually, it made more sense, certainly on paper, for the DreamWorks library to go to a Paramount or whoever, Fox, whoever they were in partners with, or who. And we decided early on that we couldn't forecast the future. And when you started doing this is where my MBA stuff finally came into play. When you started trying to figure out how many dollars, you couldn't, because it's 25 years from now, how do you know what a title is going to be worth? So every studio in town, or whoever bid, I think there were 2 or 3 studios bid, they bid a cash amount. And what we bid is time period clearances fixed in prime for 25 years. So no matter what happens, you can be guaranteed in 2022 that Gladiator will air on WPIX in New York and WGN in Chicago and 98% of the country in 2022 during the window it's available. And when they started to figure, well, when they started to analyze our proposal, they realized that because nobody knew what it was going to be worth, the natural inclination is to put a number that's probably going to be too low as a cash advance. We didn't offer any type of a cash advance, but we did offer continued cash flow till I think it ends 2025. So that's the way we did, and they thought it was a great approach, and we ended up doing the deal with DreamWorks, which shocked everybody in town that we ended up with it. And the stations loved it because they were great projects, and it's a relationship that is currently continuing, and will till 2025.
What is Tribune Studios, the all-digital Tribune Studios? This is the first of its type. I mean, describe what that is.
Okay, well, Tribune Entertainment essentially was a distributor that also did some production. The KTLA lot, which is where KTLA Channel 5 is located, KTLA is the station on the lot, and the lot was it was owned by Tribune, but managed by an outside company. Hollywood Center is the company that managed it. So that always bothered me, because, I mean, we were, number one, having an outside company managing the studios that you're trying to access, to me, didn't make any sense. And there was a building on the lot, which was built in 1928. It was the original home of Warner Brothers that had been vacant on the lot probably for 10 years. And it actually was kind of an eyesore, because, I mean, it hadn't really been maintained. I mean, it had been maintained a little on the outside. Inside, it was just wrecked. So we were looking for new revenue sources. So my team and I decided to pitch Chicago, Dennis and his people, because he had financial types, just like we did, on the idea of, number one, renovating the Warner Brother building. Number two, Tribune Entertainment would move into the top floor, and we would convert the bottom floor to production offices that we would lease out in connection with all of the sets on the lot. So that was the part of the game plan. But one of the things that was problematic is that the sets really weren't making that much money because they had all sorts of stuff in them. They had, you know, 1 or 2 shows that would come in, go out. They were doing commercials in them. I think an occasional feature would come in for a couple of days, but they really, you know, they were used maybe 40 or 50% of the time. And it took me a while to figure this out. Actually, I think all the smart guys in my division knew it, in my technical division, the engineering division. It took me a while to figure what they were talking about. But by converting from analog to digital, what that meant to a civilian is that instead of shooting 1 show a day, you could shoot 2. And because reality television and non-scripted television was starting to take over the industry, we assumed that if we had digital facilities, we could fill up all the studios with just reality television, get rid of all the commercials and all the, you know, whatever type of deal, and do twice as much production as they're currently capable of doing. So I flew to Chicago with my CFO and my engineer, who could answer all the tough questions, and we kind of said, here's the plan. And if you give us $10 million, we'll renovate the lot, we'll move in, we'll get more office space, and we'll fill up the stages twice as much, and you'll end up making a hell of a lot of money, relative speaking. And they analyzed it, and we went actually several trips back to Chicago, and finally Dennis said, you know what, let's give it a shot. And we did, and it worked out so that when I left Tribune Studios, just the physical plant, which was now under Tribune Entertainment because we took over the management and everything, that was about 40 to 45% of our profits just from that operation. So we kind of created an asset that was dormant, had a lot of fun doing it. I mean, just working in a building where Jack Warner was in and his brother at the other end. And actually, Gene Autry had his own suite of offices because at one point he had owned KTLA as well. In fact, I ended up in Gene Autry's office. That was, you know, it was the most logical place for me. And we had to send back the drawings to Chicago for approval, and they were going to do all the metrics, et cetera. And I got a call from Chicago and said, you know what, I got a suggestion for you, Dick. I said, okay. He said, you know Gene Autry's office? I said, yeah. He said, I just want to say one thing. That office, the way it is right now, is bigger than John Madigan, who's chairman of the company. You sure you want to submit that? I said, you know what, let's cut that down a little. So I cut it into like my assistant's office. We made it, whatever we did. And it was big enough to begin with. I mean, even where I ended up. And they approved the entire process, and now it's a functioning studio operation. And it was the first digital studio operation in the country. We kind of set the template, and it wasn't my idea. It was the guys who understood what it could have been, because I literally didn't even know what digital was until they started taking me to school and teaching me how it could work in success.
It was on your watch.
Oh, yeah, I was definitely involved.
So Hollywood Center was out in terms of managing the lot, right?
Yeah.
And then as an example of digital shows that could be done more effectively or fill the stages, what kinds of things were replacing the commercials and the
the thing that turned out to be a great business for us is game show, court shows and game shows. Okay. We did Family Feud there a couple of years when we first took over Family Feud. But court shows were great because court shows, by their nature, you bang them out because they don't have a lot of moving parts. Right. So we were doing Judge Judy and Judge Joe back to back in the same set, same day. And we used that type of logic and filled up, the stages around town. And depending on and we only went after non-scripted because they were really high price, in and out, as opposed to, okay, we're going to be here a year, so we really want a deal. And also, the digital doesn't lend itself to film. You have to be able to shoot it on, with digital tape at that point. So it turned out to be a great business.
Back to some of the shows, either on the lot or not on the lot, but Tribune Entertainment. And we can kind of go through briefly, but just whatever you think is significant to say about each show. Let's start with Soul Train.
Soul Train, in a lot of ways, was one of my favorite projects. It was, I really admired Don Cornelius because he founded Soul Train in Chicago, brought it to L.A., kept it on the air 35 years, started several sub-franchises like Soul Train Music Awards and Lady of Soul, and he did it all without any help. I mean, he did it all on his own. Occasionally he would call and maybe ask for cash advance on some of the receivables or whatever, but he never had a partner. He listened to his own counsel. He could be really stubborn, but he had a lot of pride in what he did. I think just as a cultural phenomenon, I think Soul Train, if you hear people in some of the tributes talk about Soul Train in their early days and how important it was to them as they were growing up, and just culturally, I think it made a big contribution to television. In fact, I personally think that Don Cornelius should be in the Hall of Fame myself. But it was a project that was a lot of fun. My wife and I went to all the Soul Train Music Awards, got to meet a lot of the icons of the business, Stevie Wonder, Biggie, etc. And it was so, different from the type of programming that I was accustomed to, and also that's on television. Now you have BET and some, programming that's for minorities, but Soul Train for a long time was kind of an oasis. It was the only show of its nature on television for probably at least 20, 25 years.
Family Feud, it's like the old Timex watch, it keeps on ticking. Talk about that just a bit, Family Feud. And did it need to be reinvented, and why does it keep going?
Well, actually, Family Feud to me is, over the last couple of years, has probably become one of my most important projects in my career. When I was at Tribune, Family Feud was part of the Fremantle acquisition. We acquired Family Feud, Card Sharks. Oh, geez, and I can't remember the other one, the other show, which we canceled like immediately. But we kept Family Feud because we thought it had it was very playable. So when I was at Tribune, it was doing, 2.5, 2.6. It wasn't a top 10 show. It was profitable because we had kind of turned it around. When Cecile took over, she was smart, so she kind of redid the finances on the project. She hammered us a little on the distribution fee. She cut the production costs, and she kept it on the air. And it did pretty well. After I left Tribune, for whatever reason, and it had nothing to do with me leaving, it's just the way lease cycles work, it started to drop off. And I got a call from Cecile in 2009. I had just come back from an adventure, and she said, by then I had my consulting business for 3 years. She said, "Can you come over?" I said, "Sure." I got a big problem. So I walked over and said, "What's your problem?" She said, "Family Feud is doing a 1/6, and if we don't do something, it won't be on the air next year." Debmar Mercury, who is Marcus we talked about earlier, and his partner Ira Bernstein, who have tremendous success in the market now, they couldn't keep it on the air. So she said, "I need you to take a look at the show and give me a plan, because we need to do something." I said, "Well, do you think it's the show?" She said, "No, I don't think it's the show, because we just had spent $100,000 on a research study, and they said the show's fine." I said, "Okay, so give me a couple of weeks." So I called stations, I analyzed the ratings. She signed me a researcher so he could do all the pulling numbers. And I looked at the trends and looked at the shows, did a fair amount of work on it. And she thought possibly it was a distribution problem. Maybe it wasn't getting the sales effort it should have. So I made an 18-page report and walked in, and Mort and I think they were ready to come across the desk at me because they thought I was basically after them. I was going to say a sales job, they're doing a lousy job and they should fire them, which I think was kind of the expectation of the the request. I said, well, it's two things. It's sales and it's the program. The sales is 20% of the problem. The program's 80%. So you see Mort and I are starting to relax in their chair like, hey, this isn't going to be a problem. And Cecile is saying, what do you mean it's the program? We spend $80,000. I said, you need to fire the host immediately. You have to announce to the market immediately that you're going to have a new host. We don't know who it is, but we're going to do that right away. You have to move it out of L.A. The production is tired. It looks boring. It looks dated. The families are all like L.A. contestant pros. They're not middle America. They're all like from the Valley. So Mort and I went out of that meeting, and they were pretty happy. And Cecile was, I think, pretty annoyed at my request or my analysis. And I didn't particularly care one way or the other because, this is what I found out. And I had spent a lot of time talking to stations. And stations, they all kind of corroborated what I was saying. So she called me back the following day and she said, okay, what do you want to do? I said, okay, well, fortunately I'd worked on the show and I said, it has to be a comic. The best host of Family Feud has always been a comic, and we have a substantial African-American audience. So it'd be great if we could get an African-American host. So she said, okay, I'll have our people give you a list of 20 names and you pick who you want. And they gave me 20 names, 15 Anglo, and George Lopez was on that list, and 5 African-American. Cedric the Entertainer was on, and I think Chris Tucker was on. And these people weren't necessarily available, but they're on the list. And Steve Harvey's name was on the list. And I knew that Steve was interested in syndication because Don Cornelius had set up a lunch with me and Steve and Don because Steve, 2 years prior, wanted to do a talk show. So I said, let's go after Steve. He's not doing anything in television right now. I know he wants to get into syndication. He's funny. And Cecile, who I give her lots of credit, she said, fine. So she made a deal that day or a couple days later with Steve. We announced it. We had to wait for a year for the current shows to air, which the old host. And Debmar Murphy kind of kept the balls up in the air juggling, and Steve Harvey came on the air. And it was like a light switch. Just like that, all of a sudden, the numbers started changing. And literally, when I walked in to the first day, Cecile called me up. The show was doing a 1.6. Flash forward to last week, it did a 5.2. So now, everybody is ecstatic. Everybody. The stations are ecstatic. Their license fees have tripled, but they don't care. The barter sales have gone through the roof. So it's really one of those cases that everybody got lucky at the same time, and it's one of those few cases that you catch lightning in a bottle. You don't do that too often in the business. American Gladiators was kind of lightning in a bottle in a lot of ways. Certainly, the Action Hours, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda was. And Family Feud, which I've had a long history, as it turns out now, because I'm still working on it, just one of those things. It's now beating Wheel and Jeopardy in the demos. Who'd have thunk?
Just to get the timeline correct, Family Feud was under your supervision while you were at Tribune, right? But
yes.
This is with your consulting company,
yes.
basically? Okay.
Yeah, the whole thing that when she called me and I had my own consulting company, this was in 2009. It had been open for business at that point 3 years.
Askin and Company?
Askin and Company,
okay.
That's right.
Okay. Okay.
And
Because
she's
Steve
still a
Harvey's been on
client.
for like 2 years now, 2 or 3?
Steve has been on for 2, and he's been re-upped for several years into the future.
Do you know a game show that's tied to the game itself, no matter who the host is, and the ones where the host is critical to the success? Do you know that going in, just from watching a game show?
Well, let's put it this way. If the game isn't a great game, you've got a problem. So it doesn't make any difference who the host is. But if you have a good game, and Family Feud is, and a lot of them are, right, the host brings it to the next level. And in the case of Family Feud, literally the host saved the game.
Sounds like those numbers are higher than his own talk show. I'm not sure, but I know that was
well,
just,
they are, but it's apples and oranges, because it's a brand new talk show as opposed to a show that's been on the air in one incarnation or another for forever.
Right. Let's go back to the Gene Roddenberry shows. Okay. Earth, Final Conflict, and then Andromeda. How were those discovered, or what were the origins of those 2 shows?
2 different ways. Initially, Gene Roddenberry's Earth Final Conflict was brought to us by David Kirshner, who was the feature producer we talked about, and also Majel Roddenberry, who was Gene's widow, who has also played the nurse on the original Star Treks. Right. Great lady, had lots of fun with her. And they pitched us the project, and actually they also pitched the project to Ed Wilson, who's been in the industry a long time, and he was running CBS. And we made a presentation on why they should go with us instead of Ed, and because we were so passionate about it, they gave us the project to produce and distribute, and we did, and it was a great relationship. So about 2 or 3 years into the first project, by that time I had become very friendly with Majel, and I said, we should do another one of these. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, come on over to my house. I have a room, and we have all of Gene's scripts and notes and all that stuff there. And if you can find anything that you really want, we'll talk. So our senior VP of development, Karen Corbin, went over with her person, and they spent about a week or so looking through the archives. And I think archives is probably a euphemism for stuff in boxes, unfiled in all sorts of random order. And we came across a concept that Gene had done somewhere, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, about the spaceship Andromeda Ascendant. And just like American Gladiators, I love the title. Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, I could see, was saleable. And then we hired several people at that point to develop the project and really kind of make it work creatively, writers, producers, etc. And that was a process that that just went on for a long time. Robert Hewitt Wolf was one of the original developers of Andromeda, and he had been on Deep Space Nine for Paramount. And as it happened, Kevin Sorbo, who was a big hit when he was doing Hercules, his 5-year term had ended on Hercules, and he was a free agent. And I knew, just because of my sales background, that he will sell in syndication just because he was on Hercules, which was a big hit, if you got him the right project. So we called his agent. His agent was a guy named Eric Gold, who's still in the business, very, very prolific, manages Ellen, and said, we'd like to, is Kevin Sorbo available?
Let's pause right here.
Okay.
And we'll go to the next tape and find out the answer.